The next time somebody accuses me of being a fake comic fan, which doesn't happen often, but the next time it happens, I'm showing them that I'm wearing Spider-Man underwear right now. Before we jump into things, guys, shout out to Volta Midnight Comics in Ann Arbor, Michigan, Detroit, Michigan. They've got a couple locations. Love that shop. A friend of mine got me this shirt a couple months ago, and yeah, just a great place. If you're in the Southeast Michigan area, go there. They're sweet. They're awesome people, great books. I highly recommend. One of the toughest things about being a Superman fan, other than the fact that it takes a long time to make a collage for the top of your comic book short box, is that people think he's not complicated. Truthfully, this is like the biggest criticism of Superman. Like, he's not interesting because he's just a good guy who does good things. And when I was younger and an idiot, I totally thought that too. Like, I was very ready to agree with that premise and say, like, I like Batman because he's like being bad sometimes, doing bad stuff, but also he's a good guy, and like I have pity on him because, you know, his parents died and stuff. And while it is kind of easier to be a Batman fan in the world today, I mean, there's never been a Lego Superman movie. And with James Gunn's Superman movie coming out next year, I thought it'd be a great time for all of us to catch up on the character and see what he actually is like, not just trust this dumb opinion that he's shallow or uninteresting, and actually read the stuff that's good. Unless you believe I'm a fake fan, this is the poster that hangs right above my bed in my apartment. This is my dad's childhood Superman poster that was given to me by my grandma when I was little, and I've kept it ever since. So the first book I recommend is actually not really something that's super essential, but I do think it's fun and it connects a lot to my childhood. It's Superman, Doomsday, and Beyond by Louise Simonson. Not only is this front cover super important because it was one of the earliest works by Alex Ross to get him noticed for his work at DC, but Louise Simonson is a legendary figure in comics. Her and her husband Walt are just some of the most pivotal people in both art and writing over the course of the 80s, the 90s, the 70s. Like, they've worked on so much stuff. This also has internal illustrations by Dan Jurgens, who worked on the comic book during the death and return of Superman, which we're going to talk about in a little bit, obviously. But it's a great little paperback read that will tell you the story of Superman losing his fight to Doomsday, dying, and then coming back to life. And because it's a novel, it's an even quicker read, at least for me, than reading a comic book. Next up, this is something that every single video you're probably watching lately that tells you to read Superman comic books is telling you to read, and that's because it is perfect, and it is the thing that's the most essential to read, I think, before the movie comes out. It's All-Star Superman. Grant Morrison and Frank Whiteley created probably the definitive 21st century Superman story with this. You can read it without really any prior knowledge of DC canon. You don't have to know what was going on in the DC universe at the time. You can just open this up and read it. The art is beautiful. The story is stunning. I just can't recommend it enough. I tell everyone in my life about this book. I was doing that before the movie was announced, but of course now I'm doubling down on it because this has been talked about a lot as a heavy inspiration for the movie. So read All-Star Superman. You will not regret it. It's really fantastic. Next up, and you'll find this as a theme throughout this, but this is something that really champions Superman's working class and inclusive aspects to his personality. Superman smashes the Klan. This is the 2019 version. There's an earlier version of this story. It's really good. It's great for kids because the art style in this is really simple, the storytelling is really approachable, and it establishes something about Superman's character that I think is really important. Something that happens a lot in modern comic book discourse is talking about the political stances of different heroes and talking about, like, Batman could do more good for the world if he just like invested in social programs instead of beat up criminals, and Iron Man is a defense contractor and that makes him unethical no matter what he does to save the world with his suits. And all that's interesting. I think it's worth talking about that stuff as the world changes and we learn more things about superheroes and their place in mythology. And in the case of Superman Smashes the Klan, it's a pretty cut and dry message that the title pretty much tells you what you're gonna get, and it's great. It does harken back to that simplicity about Superman that sometimes gets criticized, but I think is important to remember, which is that he's a good person who's gonna do the right thing, and that's pretty much the end of it for him. Next up, while I do have a book as an example of this, this is kind of just a broad recommendation, which is to go back and read the old stuff. So this is the greatest Superman stories ever told. It's part of a paperback series that has the greatest Batman stories, the greatest Joker stories, etc., etc. But I really do recommend going back and reading some of this stuff. The original Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster stories. The artwork is really of its time in a really cool way. You can see some of the groundbreaking elements they were introducing, and it's also interesting to see how comic books have evolved since then. I mean, at the time you were seeing a lot of really standard square panels and a grid for every single page of the book, and now things are much more dynamic and much more interesting because the art form has had almost 100 years to develop. So reading stuff from the 40s, 50s, 60s is all a super important way to understand why Superman has been such an enduring character. I am ashamed to say with this next recommendation, I don't have it. I don't own a copy of it. I've read it before. It was a while ago, but Crisis on Infinite Earths. If you're a Marvel fan, you'll understand Crisis as somewhat of a parallel to Secret Wars or Infinity War, where it was an event that was so huge that it had permanent ramifications on the entire universe going forward. In the case of Crisis, it also had like more of an effect than Secret Wars or Infinity War or any of those things, because it reset the timeline and allowed DC to like completely revamp their continuity and reintroduce things and mess with stuff. Plus, the late great George Perez did one of the all-time greatest comic book covers during Crisis on Infinite Earths, so I can't recommend it enough for pure iconography. And yeah, if we're gonna talk about iconography, I mean, there's a book that sticks out right away. It's the one that comes up a lot in the last couple years, like a lot, when talking about all the ways that DC is going to incorporate Elseworld stories and imagery into the DCU that James Gunn is making. So if you're excited about Superman, yes, read All-Star Superman that we talked about, but also it is going to be really important that you read Kingdom Come. Now, I say this as someone who obviously, based on some of the posters I've got hanging up, is a huge Alex Ross fan, like die hard. But even with that aside, like if I didn't consider the fact that I think Alex Ross is, you know, maybe the greatest of all time at what he does, I still think this story is really, really good, really important, really timely. Every time I've read it, it's like relevant to what's happening in modern comic books and superhero fandom. It's beautiful, it's compelling, it is as good as something like Watchmen at taking what's happening in superhero comic books at the time, but also kind of making this timeless tale and satirizing it and criticizing it, but also staying faithful to it and being a love letter to the genre. One of the things that a lot of Elseworld stories does really well with DC is that it's able to allow the characters to be reinterpreted both like visually and also character-wise. So for example, the version of Batman in Kingdom Come is like a unique take on Bruce Wayne, and they also play out the idea of what would happen once he got considerably older than he is, and not just in a way like Dark Knight Rises or something, but like really, really old, like into the far future. What would that look like? And I find that stuff really interesting and compelling. Superman specifically, you know, they talk a lot in this book about like his durability and his age and like how he would be Superman as an old man and whether that would be possible. And that adds this element to Kingdom Come that makes it really interesting, because you can see how things are playing out with a totally different version of Superman than we're used to. Also, the S crest, the Superman logo that he wears in Kingdom Come, has become really iconic and has been interpreted a lot of different ways in a lot of the live action and animated Superman suits that we've seen over the last decade or so. A quick honorable mention before we keep going, because as a piece of comics history, I find this issue really interesting, and this is issue 1 of The Man of Steel, which is John Byrne's run on the character. Now, John Byrne, love him or hate him, has done some really influential work on a lot of different major characters over the years. You know, he reinvented the Fantastic Four and has had an extensive career all throughout comics history. This one is very interesting, Man of Steel 1, because this is, by most records, the first ever variant cover. There were 2 different versions of this cover. This is just one of them. But this and Spider-Man and Mary Jane getting married are kind of in competition for some of the most groundbreaking things to introduce variant covers to a general wide market. So if you're sick of going to the comic book store and seeing 9 different copies of issue 1 of something, you have John Byrne and the Man of Steel to blame for it. There's a few kind of unconventional picks that I wanted to toss in here as well. One of these is Superman Red Sun. This might not be something that people recommend to you very quickly when you talk about wanting to get into Superman comics, but I found it to be a really, really great read, and it's super small. It's really short, so you can burn through it super fast. The premise of this book is that Superman landed in Soviet Russia instead of landing in the United States, and then like all of his political power is coming from the Russian state, and there's like United States influence and Lex Luthor working for the US government and all that stuff. Most of what I find interesting about this is that Mark Millar managed to actually write something I enjoyed. That's super shocking, because usually I just find his writing unbearable, but also the art is really good, the dialogue is interesting, and the premise is more than like something really shallow that's then used to tell some sort of propaganda story. There's a lot of nuance and like humanity to it, which I like. So yeah, I recommend Superman Red Sun. I think it's a great read, and I think it gives you insight into what about Superman's character is innate and what about him is because he was raised in the United States in the 1940s or whatever version of history you want to go by. Next up, returning to Grant Morrison's work with the character. I wouldn't call this like really essential, but I do recommend it, and that's Grant Morrison's run on Superman in the mainline continuity. Now, part of this is the fact that Rags Morales has some really incredible art in this. I really like his style, so the way that he portrays Superman is really cool, but also it's Grant Morrison. Even Grant Morrison at their like not optimal writing capacity is still better than most of the people that are writing a lot of comics. That might be too high a praise, I understand, but I'm a big fan. This one might be a little bit hard to find, which is why it's yet again another unconventional pick. It's an Elseworld story called Superman's Metropolis. I really recommend this, mostly for art reasons. It's really beautiful. The interiors have this really cool sort of pastel charcoal feeling to them, and setting Superman's story as something in a different time period with an almost cubist art style to go along with it. I thought this book, just like Red Sun, did a really good job of taking away most of what you identify with Superman in terms of his aesthetic, but showing you that the person and the character underneath it is still very compelling and interesting. Just like I was saying about Superman Red Son and Mark Millar and not liking anything he writes, but liking that one, there's another book by an author who I normally dislike pretty much everything they write, but I will say I think this is a good thing to read for insight into the character of Superman, and that's Flashpoint by Jeff Johns. One of the most interesting things to me about the failure of the Flash movie with Ezra Miller is that it is a very faithful adaptation of this book, like almost scene for scene, but it's not good, and the book is. There's a ton of factors that go into that, like obviously the CGI is really bad, the acting is really bad, like some of the casting choices and the way that they make Michael Keaton's Batman like such a part of the story is just, you know, it's upsetting, but also it's a testament to the fact that the book is really enjoyable. I like it. I think it's a compelling read. I think it does really cool things with the Flash's powers. And importantly, while I don't really care that the movie gender swaps Superman, because I don't think that makes any difference in the way that the story plays out, this book shows you a Superman that doesn't have access to the sun and is a science experiment in the lab, and I would get into spoilers if I went any farther, but you get to see Superman in a totally different light than we've ever seen him before. So while a lot of people love to talk about the trope of like evil Superman being common, I think weak Superman is a really interesting thing. And speaking of evil Superman, don't read Injustice. Don't read Hush. I mean, read Hush for Batman, but that's not the evil Superman you're interested in. And Injustice is not the evil Superman you're interested in. If you want evil Superman, read Invincible, watch The Boys, and if you really wanted to actually be evil Superman, I don't know, go play Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League or something. Killing the Justice League would require killing Superman, something that's only been accomplished one time in comics continuity, and that is the death of Superman, paired well with the return of Superman. Now, I put these books in my do not read list, a video that came out a couple months ago where I talked about books I don't recommend to people. And if you are starting on Superman, this is not the first thing you should pick up. You shouldn't start here, because just like reading Watchmen, if you've never read a superhero comic, it's not going to land for you if you don't have the context of why it was important and impactful at the time. Now, we could talk for hours about the way that 90s comic printing and the culture of 90s comics led to doing something like the death of Superman from a publishing perspective, but from a character perspective, if you're not steeped in who Superman is and his energy and what he brings to Metropolis and the people around him, the death and return of Superman isn't really gonna hit for you. Now, my favorite aspect of the return of Superman is the alternate Supermen that come in, like Steel and the Android Superman and Superboy. I think those characters are awesome. I really, really like them. But again, they work best as a contrast to who Superman is and was at the time. So read the 30s and 40s stuff, you know, read some 80s stories, read Kingdom Come, and then go read Death of Superman. That will really help put into perspective why him dying was such a huge deal for so many people at the time. And that's it, guys. I think if you read this stuff, you'll be a little bit more prepped for the movie. You'll be prepared for some of the aesthetics that are probably going to be happening. You'll know enough about the character to know when there's an homage to something really cool about Superman. And I'm really hoping it's a great movie. I mean, I'm excited for it. Not as much as I'm excited about the new Fantastic Four. Obviously, that's like my top billing. But hey, it's Superman. It's probably going to be good. I'll see you guys next time. Thanks for watching.